Biography of George W. Bush. Chapter 1. Early Life. George Walker Bush was born on July 6, 1946, in New Haven, Connecticut, to George H.W. Bush and Barbara Pierce. Bush. He is the oldest of 6 children in the Bush family. His father, George H.W. Bush, would later become the 41st President of the United States, and his mother, Barbara, was a former First Lady and a dedicated philanthropist. The Bush family moved to Texas when George was a young child, and he grew up in the city of Midland. George attended several schools throughout his childhood, including the Phillips Academy in Massachusetts. He was a good student, but his early years were also marked by struggles with discipline and focus. Despite this, George's family always encouraged him to work hard and follow his own path. After graduating from high school, George went on to attend Yale University, where he studied history and earned a degree in 1968. After Yale, George Bush decided to enlist in the Texas Air National Guard and serve as a pilot. He spent time in the Guard during the late 1960s and early 1970s, at a time when the United States was involved in the Vietnam War. George later completed his service and returned to Texas, where he became more involved in business and politics. His early adult years were shaped by a desire to carve his own identity, separate from his famous family. Chapter 2. Political Beginnings. George W. Bush's political career began in the late 1970s. After several years in business, he decided to run for political office. In 1978, he ran for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives in Texas, but lost. Despite this setback, George remained focused on his goal of public service. Over the next few years, he continued to build relationships and gain experience in politics. In 1988, George's father, George H.W. Bush, was running for president. George W. Bush supported his father's campaign and helped with the political strategy. After his father became president in 1989, George W. Bush began to consider running for office himself. In 1994, he decided to run for governor of Texas. His campaign was successful, and he won the election. This marked the beginning of his political career in a leadership role. As governor of Texas, George W. Bush gained national recognition for his leadership style and his focus on education, health care, and crime reform. He worked on improving the state's economy and increasing the number of jobs. His popularity in Texas grew, and people began to see him as a potential candidate for higher office. Chapter 3. The Road to the Presidency. In 1999, George W. Bush announced his candidacy for President of the United States. His campaign focused on issues like tax cuts, national security, and education reform. He was determined to bring a new style of leadership to Washington, one based on compassion and a desire to unite the country. The 2000 presidential election was one of the closest and most controversial in American history. George W. Bush ran against Al Gore, the vice president under Bill Clinton. The election was decided by a narrow margin in the state of Florida, and after a long legal battle over vote recounts, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of Bush. On January 20, 2001, George W. Bush was sworn in as the 43rd President of the United States. As president, George W. Bush promised to bring change to Washington and make decisions based on what was best for the American people. His presidency began with a focus on domestic issues such as tax reform and education, but his time in office would soon be shaped by global events. Chapter 4. September 11, 2001. A Nation Transformed. On September 11, 2001. The United States experienced one of the most tragic days in its history. Terrorists from the extremist group Al-Qaeda hijacked planes and carried out coordinated attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Nearly 3,000 people were killed in these attacks. In response to the attacks, President George W. Bush led a global effort to combat terrorism. He declared a war on terror and quickly took steps to strengthen U.S. national security. The U.S. launched military operations in Afghanistan to dismantle the Taliban regime, which had supported al-Qaeda, and to hunt down those responsible for the attacks. The events of September 11th had a profound impact on George W. Bush's presidency and the nation as a whole. The attacks led to significant changes in U.S. foreign policy, security measures, and the way Americans viewed the world. George Bush became a symbol of leadership during a time of national crisis, and his decisions in the aftermath of the attacks would shape his presidency. Chapter 5. The Iraq War. In 2003, President George W. Bush made the decision to invade Iraq. The justification for the war was based on the belief that Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein was hiding weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and that Iraq posed a threat to the security of the United States and its allies. The U.S. and its coalition partners launched military operations to remove Saddam Hussein from power. The invasion of Iraq was controversial, and many people around the world questioned whether it was justified. While the initial military action was successful in overthrowing Saddam Hussein's regime, the aftermath of the war led to significant challenges. Iraq descended into chaos, and a prolonged conflict ensued. The war in Iraq became a major issue throughout Bush's second term, with increasing criticism over the handling of the post-war situation. The Iraq War also led to debates about U.S. foreign policy, national security, and the role of the U.S. in the Middle East. President Bush remained committed to the idea that removing Saddam Hussein was necessary to protect global security. But the war's high costs, both in terms of lives lost and financial resources spent, would become a defining part of his presidency. Chapter 6. The Economy and the 2008 Financial Crisis. During George W. Bush's second term, the U.S. faced a severe financial crisis. The economy, which had been growing for years, suddenly began to show signs of trouble. The collapse of major banks and financial institutions, as well as the housing market crisis, led to a nationwide recession. In response to the economic collapse, President Bush implemented several emergency measures to try to stabilize the economy. His administration passed a large economic stimulus package, which included tax cuts and government bailouts for struggling financial institutions. Despite these efforts, the economy continued to struggle, and the financial crisis had a lasting impact on the country. The 2008 financial crisis marked a difficult period for President Bush and his administration. While many of his policies were aimed at strengthening the economy, the crisis underscored the challenges of managing an economy in a globalized world. The economic downturn would also be a major issue for his successor, Barack Obama. Chapter 7. Second Term and Domestic Achievements. George W. Bush's second term as president, which began in 2005, was marked by a focus on several key domestic issues. One of the most significant achievements of his second term was the passage of the Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement and Modernization Act, which expanded Medicare to include prescription drug coverage for seniors. President Bush also worked to address education reform with the No Child Left Behind Act, which aimed to improve education standards across the country and hold schools accountable for student performance. While the law received mixed reviews, it was an important part of Bush's domestic agenda. Another focus during his second term was immigration reform. President Bush proposed a comprehensive immigration plan that included measures to secure the border and provide a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. However, the plan faced strong opposition in Congress and was not passed. Chapter 8: Legacy and Criticism. As George W. Bush left office in January 2009, his presidency was viewed with mixed opinions. Many people admired his leadership during the 9/11 attacks and his efforts to combat terrorism, but his decisions, particularly the Iraq War and the handling of the financial crisis, led to widespread criticism. His approval ratings dropped significantly during the final years of his presidency, but over time, some of his policies and decisions have been reevaluated. For example, the decision to remove Saddam Hussein from power is seen by some as a key turning point in the Middle East, while others believe it led to long-term instability. George W. Bush's legacy continues to be debated, but he is remembered as a leader who faced unprecedented challenges, both at home and abroad. His presidency left a lasting impact on U.S. foreign policy, national security, and the American economy. Chapter 9: Life after the Presidency. After leaving the White House, George W. Bush returned to Texas, where he focused on his personal life and his family. He also began to engage in various public activities, including speaking at events and working on his memoirs. In 2010, he published his autobiography, Decision Points, which reflected on the key moments and decisions of his presidency. George W. Bush has also worked with several charitable organizations and initiatives. He focused on issues such as veterans services, education, and global health. He has been particularly involved in supporting efforts to fight AIDS in Africa and improve education for children in the U.S. His post-presidency years have been marked by a quieter public life, but he has remained active in promoting causes he cares about. In 2014, President Bush and his father, George H.W. Bush, established the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library Foundation, which aims to promote public service and leadership. George W. Bush also developed a love for painting and took up painting as a hobby, often creating portraits of veterans and world leaders. Chapter 10: Legacy and Impact. George W. Bush's legacy is complex, shaped by his leadership during a time of crisis and the long-term effects of his policies. His decisions, particularly the war on terrorism, the Iraq War, and his handling of the 2008 financial crisis, have been the subject of much debate. While his presidency was controversial, it also brought lasting changes to U.S. foreign policy, national security, and domestic issues. His efforts in the war on terror and his response to the September 11th attacks are remembered as key moments in his time in office. Additionally, his domestic achievements in education and healthcare have left a mark on American society. George W. Bush's impact on the United States and the world continues to be felt. His leadership during difficult times, both in terms of national security and the economy, has shaped the way future presidents approach crises. His legacy will likely continue to evolve as historians and the public reflect on the complexities of his presidency.